There are moments when survival requires you to become invisible, when your existence depends on being nothing more than part of the furniture, silent and unnoticed, moving through the world of the wealthy like a ghost they can't quite see. For Jenny Spencer, that moment had become her entire life. She worked as a maid in the roadie estate not because she loved cleaning crystal or polishing marble, but because the salary kept a roof over her head and food on a table that only sat one. 3 years after losing her son David to an illness she couldn't afford to fight, invisibility had become survival. And survival was all she had left, until the night of the charity gala, when she saw a little boy sitting alone in a ballroom full of people and made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. What followed was dangerous compassion, a father's paralyzing fear, and a lesson that sometimes the person who needs saving most is the one who appears strongest. The champagne flutes sparkled like diamonds under the crystal chandeliers as I moved silently along the edge of the grand ballroom, my gray maid's uniform making me invisible among the tailored tuxedos and flowing evening gowns. The roadie estate was hosting its annual charity gala, and every power player in the city had come to pay tribute, or tribute disguised as charity, to Albert Rohde, the man whose name was whispered with equal parts respect and terror. It smelled of expensive perfume, imported cigars, and that particular scent of wealth, a subtle mixture of entitlement and power that seemed to cling to every surface. "Would you like some water, sir?" I offered to a man in a platinum watch that probably cost more than my entire year's rent, my voice small and practiced. He didn't even acknowledge me as he waved a dismissive hand, continuing his conversation as if I were nothing but a piece of mobile furniture. I was used to it by now. 6 months of working the private wings of the roadie mansion had taught me invisibility was part of the job description. My gray polyester uniform was deliberately plain, designed to blend into walls and corners, a stark contrast to the designer silks and hand-beaded gowns surrounding me. My feet already ached in the mandatory flats we were required to wear for silent movement, and we were only 90 minutes into what would be a 6-hour event. The Children's Medical Research Benefit, they called it. Though I suspected half these people had never actually visited a sick child in their lives. I wasn't supposed to be working the gala. My duties were confined to the upstairs private quarters, far from the glittering world of Albert Rohde's business associates and their perfectly curated lives. But Maria, the head housekeeper, had fallen ill that morning, and I desperately needed the overtime pay. Rent was due in 4 days, and my landlord had stopped accepting excuses 3 months ago. So here I was, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, trying to remain as invisible as the air these people breathed. "Careful," a woman in a blood-red gown snapped as she turned sharply, nearly colliding with my water pitcher. "Watch where you're standing." Not her fault, of course. I was the one expected to anticipate every movement, to exist in the spaces between their steps. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," I murmured automatically, stepping back against the wall. That's when I first noticed him. The little boy. He sat alone at a corner table near the French doors that opened onto the terrace, his small legs dangling from a chair that was clearly too high for his frame, while other children at the gala chased each other through the garden visible through the glass, laughing and shouting in expensive clothes their parents didn't worry about them ruining. This boy remained perfectly still. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the playing children with an expression that shattered something inside my chest. His small face was eerily mature, dark eyebrows drawn together over serious brown eyes that tracked every movement of the children outside. His suit was impeccable, custom-tailored navy blue with a crisp white shirt and a bow tie that matched his father's, but it was his complete isolation that made my breath catch. In a room full of hundreds of people, no one seemed to see him. I recognized him immediately. Michael Albert Rohde. Mike, as I'd heard the upstairs nanny call him when his father wasn't within earshot. He was maybe 7 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark hair slicked back in a way too formal for a child. I'd seen him exactly twice in my 6 months working at the estate. Always at a distance, always accompanied by medical staff or his nanny. Never playing, never running, never doing the things 7-year-old boys were supposed to do. The household staff whispered about him. The sick boy. The asthma kid. The reason Albert Rohde allowed no one near his son without explicit permission and extensive background checks. The child he was slowly suffocating with protection. "Jenny, the dessert cart needs to be prepped in the kitchen, and we're short 2 servers for the appetizer round." Marcos, the event supervisor, hissed as he swept past with his ever-present clipboard. "You'll need to cover Section 3 after you finish your current tables." I nodded automatically, but my eyes kept drifting back to the boy. A couple approached his table, elegantly dressed and laughing, but instead of acknowledging Mike, They simply took the empty chairs from his table and carried them away. The boy didn't look up. He just kept watching the children play outside, his small hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I knew that look. God help me. I knew that look too well. I had seen it on my son David's face in the last year of his life, when the illness had progressed so far that simply walking to the bathroom left him breathless and exhausted. David had watched other children play from our apartment window, his small hand pressed against the glass, and I had held him and promised him things would get better, knowing with terrible certainty that I was lying. David had been gone for 3 years now. The grief had dulled from a screaming wound to a constant ache that lived in my chest like a second heartbeat. But moments like this, seeing another child trapped by illness and fear, made the pain surge back with devastating clarity. I forced myself to move, to continue my rounds, to refill water glasses and clear empty plates like the invisible servant I was paid to be. But every few minutes, my gaze returned to Mike, still sitting alone, still watching the world through glass he wasn't allowed to touch. Then the room changed. I felt it before I saw it, that subtle shift in atmosphere when someone truly dangerous enters a space. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they altered, became more careful, more calculated. People who had been relaxed suddenly stood straighter, smiled wider, laughed at things that weren't funny. That's when I saw him. Albert Rohde didn't so much walk as command the space around him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained against his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His dark hair was styled back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and harsh planes that suggested a man who had never known softness. Silver touched his temples, but instead of making him look older, it made him look more dangerous, like a wolf in its prime. His eyes were what caught the breath in my throat. Dark, almost black, they scanned the ballroom with the calculated precision of a predator assessing prey. Cold, completely, utterly cold, as if warmth had been surgically removed from his soul. 2 men flanked him, both built like brick walls, their expensive suits failing to conceal the outline of weapons I knew were holstered beneath the fabric. They moved in perfect synchronization, creating a protective bubble around him that no one would dare penetrate. I knew who he was. Of course, everyone who worked in the household knew Albert Rohde, though few had ever spoken directly to him. The staff who lasted longest were the ones who understood the rules without being told. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look him in the eye, don't ask questions. And never ever go near his son without permission. His power wasn't just feared, it was absolute. He controlled territories, businesses, politicians. His legitimate enterprises, real estate development, luxury hotels, private security, were fronts for operations no one discussed in polite company. His charity donations were celebrated in the society pages, even while everyone pretended not to know that the money was washed clean from activities that destroyed lives. He was untouchable, unreachable, absolutely terrifying, and he was walking directly toward the corner where his son sat alone, watching children play through glass. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with this story. Before we dive into the story, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing all the different places this story reaches, from small towns to major cities. It reminds me that stories like Jenny and Mike's matter everywhere. And if you're enjoying this, please hit that subscribe button. It truly makes a difference and ensures you never miss another story. Now, let's continue with what happens the morning after Jenny crosses that forbidden line. Now, let's get back to the story. I arrived at the estate the next morning, with my resignation already written in my mind. The words were simple, direct, designed to get me out of the building before security could be called. I regret my inappropriate behavior last night. I understand my employment is terminated. I'll collect my final paycheck by mail. My hands shook as I swiped my employee badge at the staff entrance. I'd barely slept, kept awake by the memory of Albert Rohde's face when he saw me holding his son's hand. That cold, deadly expression that promised consequences I didn't want to imagine. But I needed this job desperately, and walking away without my final pay wasn't an option. I'd at least face whatever was coming. The staff locker room was unusually quiet. Maria, who'd returned from her illness, looked up when I entered, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Rohde wants to see you. In his private study. Immediately, her voice was flat, professional, but I saw the pity in her eyes. No one was summoned to Albert Rohde's private study unless something had gone very, very wrong. That room was where business was conducted, where decisions were made that staff whispered about in frightened voices, where people went in and sometimes didn't come out the same. I didn't bother changing into my uniform. What was the point? I followed the route Maria indicated, through corridors I'd never been allowed to enter, past rooms whose doors remained closed to someone of my status. 2 men in dark suits appeared from nowhere, flanking me without a word, escorting me like a prisoner. The study doors were massive, dark wood that looked older than the house itself. One of the men knocked twice, a sound that echoed like a judge's gavel. A single word came from inside. Enter. Albert Rohde sat behind a desk that could have landed aircraft, his presence somehow filling the enormous room despite his stillness. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind him looked out over manicured gardens, but the light streaming in only made him look more imposing, a dark silhouette against brightness. His expression was exactly as I remembered, carved from stone, utterly unreadable. He didn't tell me to sit, didn't offer any greeting, just looked at me with those black eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh to the fear beneath. The silence stretched until I thought I might scream just to break it. Finally, he spoke. One question, delivered in a voice that was quiet and infinitely more terrifying than shouting. Why would you risk my son's life? Something in me snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the realization that I'd already lost this job, this income, possibly my ability to work anywhere in this city once Albert Rohde made his displeasure known. Whatever the reason, I stopped caring about consequences. I wasn't risking his life, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I was trying to give him one. There's a difference, Mr. Rohde, between keeping someone alive and letting them actually live. His eyes narrowed dangerously, but I couldn't stop now. The words were pouring out. 3 years of grief finding an exit. I had a son, David. He died 3 years ago. Leukemia. I watched him waste away in a hospital bed. Watched him stare out windows at other children playing. Watched him ask me why he couldn't run anymore. Why he couldn't be normal. And you know what killed him, Mr. Rohde? Not the cancer. The fear. He stopped fighting because he was so afraid of the pain. So afraid of trying and failing, that he just gave up. He was 6 years old and he gave up because all anyone ever told him was what he couldn't do. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to continue, to meet those terrifying eyes. Your son sat in that ballroom last night, watching other children play with the same look David had. That look that says he's already accepted he'll never be like them. He's 7 years old and you've convinced him that his life is something to be endured, not lived. So yes, I asked him if he wanted to run. Because dying slowly in a gilded cage is still dying, Mr. Rohde, and I won't watch another child do it. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Albert Rohde stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. And for a moment I thought I'd gone too far, that I'd just signed something far worse than a termination letter. But then I saw it, just for a second, so brief I almost missed it. His stone facade cracked. Something raw and wounded flashed through those cold eyes before disappearing behind walls rebuilt in an instant. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost human. Sit down, Miss Spencer. We need to talk. I sat in the leather chair across from Albert Rohde's massive desk, my legs unsteady, my mind racing to understand what was happening. This wasn't how firing someone worked. This wasn't how anything worked in my experience. Albert stood and moved to the windows, his back to me, his silhouette dark against the morning light. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't expected. I've been watching you with my son. Not last night. For weeks. The way you move through the upstairs quarters when you clean. How you always stop when you pass his room. How you listen to make sure he's all right even though it's not your responsibility. How you straighten the books on his shelf in the order he prefers, even though no one told you he arranges them that way. My breath caught. I hadn't realized anyone noticed those small things. Hadn't realized I was being observed. He turned to face me, and something in his expression had shifted. The stone was still there, but beneath it I sensed something else. Desperation, perhaps. Or the closest thing a man like him could come to it. Michael has severe asthma. Life-threatening. His mother died giving birth to him, and the trauma, the medical complications, damaged his lungs. He's had 3 attacks severe enough to require hospitalization. The last one nearly killed him. Every doctor, every specialist I've consulted has told me the same thing. Keep him calm. Keep him safe. Avoid all strenuous activity. Any exertion could trigger an attack that might be his last. I understood then. The isolation. The overprotection. The prison of safety he'd built around his son. But I also understood that prison was killing Mike in a different way. Slower but just as certain. I'm not firing you, Miss Spencer. I'm offering you a position. Full-time. You'll become Michael's companion and physical therapist. You'll help him build strength, teach him to manage his condition, introduce him to activities he's been denied, all under careful medical supervision. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. You want me to do exactly what you just implied could kill him? No. I want you to teach him how to live without killing himself. There's a difference. His jaw tightened. Last night, when I saw you with him, when I saw his face light up in a way I haven't seen in years, I realized something. I've been so focused on keeping him alive that I've forgotten to let him live. You were right about that. But if we do this, we do it on my terms. He returned to his desk, pulled out a folder, slid it across to me. The salary listed on the top page made my vision blur. It was more than I made in a year. More than I'd made in 2 years. You'll work directly with Michael's medical team. Every activity will be approved. Every session monitored. You'll report to me daily on his progress, his breathing, any concerns. You'll have full authority during your time with him, but you'll answer to me for every decision, every activity, every breath he takes. If anything happens to him, if his condition worsens, if there's even one serious attack, this arrangement ends immediately. The unspoken threat hung in the air. This arrangement ends, and possibly so do you. I wasn't naive enough to miss the implications. I'd be entering deeper into a Mafia boss's world, becoming indispensable to the one thing he cared about most. If I failed, if Mike got hurt, I wouldn't just lose a job, I'd lose everything. But I thought of Mike's face last night, that desperate hope, that longing, and I thought of David, who never got the chance Mike was being offered. I have conditions too, I heard myself say, surprised by my own voice. I need Sundays off. Non-negotiable. And I need to be able to walk away if you try to interfere with my methods once the medical team approves them. You hired me for my judgment, Mr. Rohde. You have to trust it. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or surprise that I dare make demands. After a long moment, he nodded once. Sundays. And professional autonomy within approved parameters. But the moment I believe you're putting him at risk, this ends. Are we clear? Crystal clear. Then we have an agreement, Miss Spencer. He extended his hand across the desk. Welcome to the family. I took his hand, his grip firm and warm and utterly binding, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd just crossed a threshold I could never uncross. For better or worse, my life was now entangled with the Rohde family, with Mike, who needed saving, and with Albert, who terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. God help me, I thought. What have I just agreed to? The first morning, Mike sat across from me in the sunroom, with his hands folded in his lap, his spine rigid, his face carefully blank. He looked like a miniature businessman about to endure a meeting he hadn't asked for. His inhaler sat on the table between us like a loaded weapon neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We're going to start very small, I told him gently. Just some breathing exercises. Nothing scary, nothing that will hurt. But I need you to trust me, Mike. Can you do that? He looked at me with those serious brown eyes that had seen too much fear for a 7-year-old. My father says you're supposed to help me get stronger, but he also says I have to be very careful. That if I'm not careful, I could get very sick. Your father's right that we need to be careful. But being careful doesn't mean being afraid. There's a difference. I smiled at him. How about we start with something simple? I'm going to teach you how to breathe properly when you feel scared or tight in your chest. Not the emergency breathing for when you're having an attack, but the kind that helps stop an attack before it starts. Over the next hour, we worked on diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing I called it, making it simple and unthreatening. Mike was hesitant at first, his body tense with anxiety, but gradually he began to relax. By the end of the session, I saw something I hadn't seen before, a tiny spark of curiosity in his eyes. The second day, we took a short walk through the garden, 20 steps out, 20 steps back. Mike's breathing remained steady, controlled. I praised him genuinely, and he almost smiled. Almost. The third day, we added gentle stretching, movements so slow and careful they barely counted as exercise, but they counted to Mike. Each successful session built a tiny brick of confidence. I was always aware of Albert's presence. I'd catch glimpses of him at windows overlooking the garden, his silhouette dark and watchful. Sometimes I'd notice security cameras turning to follow our movements. Once, on the fourth day, I looked up during a breathing exercise to find Albert standing in the doorway of the sunroom, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. He said nothing, just watched for several minutes before disappearing as silently as he'd arrived. It should have felt intrusive. That constant surveillance should have made me nervous. But I realized something crucial. He never interfered. Never corrected me. Never stepped in to stop an activity. He was watching to learn, not to control. Watching to see if I could be trusted with the most precious thing in his world. By the end of the first week, Mike was a different child. Not dramatically, not obviously. But the tension in his shoulders had eased slightly. His breathing was more natural. And he'd started asking questions, small ones about what we'd do next. Whether we could try walking a bit further tomorrow. The breakthrough came on day 8. We were in the garden, and I'd brought a soft foam ball. Nothing heavy, nothing that required real exertion. Just a gentle game of catch, standing 6 feet apart. Mike was uncertain at first, glancing toward the house where he knew his father was watching. But I encouraged him, made it playful, made it safe. And then it happened. Mike caught the ball with both hands, surprised by his own success, and laughed. A real, genuine, childhood laugh that rang out across the garden like music. I froze, stunned by the beauty of that sound. And in the window of the study above us, I saw Albert. He'd been watching, as always, but something in his posture had changed. His hand was pressed against the glass, his head bowed slightly, and even from that distance I could see his shoulders shake once, twice. The most powerful, dangerous man I'd ever encountered, undone completely by the sound of his son's laughter. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about Mike. It was about a father learning to let go, brick by terrifying brick. And somehow, impossibly, I was the one being trusted to show him how. I'd stayed late to update Mike's progress journal, a detailed record Albert had requested of every session, every exercise, every breath that seemed labored or concerning. It was nearly 11 when I finally finished, the house quiet except for the distant hum of security systems and the occasional footstep of night staff. I was heading toward the staff quarters when I noticed light spilling from the library, a room I'd been told was Albert's private sanctuary after business hours. I should have walked past, should have minded my own business. But something made me pause at the partially open door. Albert sat in a leather chair facing a large monitor, his jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened in a way I'd never seen. On the screen, security footage played, black and white images of Mike and me in the garden that afternoon. He was watching his son laugh during our game of catch, and his hand gripped a crystal tumbler so tightly I thought the glass might shatter. He knew I was there. I'm certain of it. But he didn't acknowledge me, didn't tell me to leave. So I did something probably foolish and definitely presumptuous. I stepped inside. That was a good session today. Mike's lung capacity is improving. The breathing exercises are working. Albert's jaw tightened. He rewinds the footage, watches it again. That moment when he catches the ball. Do you see how his chest moves? The slight hitch in his breath. That could have been the start of an attack. It wasn't. It was excitement. Normal, healthy excitement that any child would feel. I moved closer, careful to maintain distance. Mr. Rhodey, I know you're afraid, but you can't protect him from every possible danger. That's not protection anymore. That's prison. He finally looked at me, and the raw pain in his eyes nearly stopped my heart. His mother died on the table. He said it so quietly I almost didn't hear. During the emergency cesarean, there were complications. Hemorrhaging the doctors couldn't control. She was there, alive, talking to me one moment, and gone the next. No warning, no time to prepare, just gone. And they handed me this tiny, struggling infant who couldn't breathe right, whose lungs were damaged from the trauma. The doctor said he might not survive the night. His voice cracked slightly. I made a promise to her, to myself, that I would keep him alive, no matter what it took. That I wouldn't fail him the way I failed her. And for 7 years, I've kept that promise. I've kept him safe. I've kept him alive. But he's not living, I said softly. And you know it. That's why you hired me. Because you saw what I saw. A child who's given up before his life has even started. Albert set down the tumbler, ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion. If something happens to him, if I let my guard down for one moment and lose him, I won't survive it. Do you understand that? I won't survive losing him. I sat down in the chair across from him, crossing boundaries I had no right to cross. I do understand. My son David, he didn't die all at once. It took months. Every day he got a little weaker, a little more tired, a little more resigned to what was coming. The medical bills bankrupted me. I sold everything, worked 3 jobs, begged for payment plans and charity care, and it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to continue. The worst part wasn't watching him die, Mr. Rohde. It was watching him stop fighting. He was 6 years old, and he looked at me one day and said, "Mommy, I'm too tired. Can I just stop now?" And I had to tell him it was okay to let go because keeping him tethered to life when every breath was agony felt more cruel than letting him rest. I met Albert's eyes, let him see my truth. That's why I see your son and it terrifies me. Because Mike has that same look. Not physically dying, but giving up in a different way. Accepting that he'll never be normal, never be free, never be anything but his illness. And I can't. I won't watch another child do that. Even if it means pushing boundaries you're not ready for me to push. Silence filled the library, heavy and fragile. Then Albert spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see your son when you look at mine. That's dangerous, Miss Spencer. For both of you. I know. But it's also why I won't fail him. I couldn't save David, but maybe I can help save Mike. Not from dying, but from never living." Albert studied me for a long moment, and something shifted between us. The antagonism, the employer-to-employee distance. It didn't disappear entirely, but it changed, softened into something more complex. We were 2 people destroyed by loss, trying desperately not to let that loss destroy the children we cared about. "He's all I have," Albert said finally. "The only good thing I've ever created in a life full of darkness." "Then let him be a child," I said gently. "Let him laugh and play and take small risks. Because a life lived in fear isn't really living at all. You already know that. You just needed someone to say it out loud." Albert picked up his glass again, but his grip had loosened. His eyes returned to the monitor, to the frozen image of Mike's laughing face. "Perhaps you're right, Miss Spencer. God help us both if you're wrong. God help us both either way," I thought. But I didn't say it out loud. The estate transformed overnight. I arrived for my morning session with Mike to find 3 additional security checkpoints between the staff entrance and the main house. Men in dark suits appeared at every corner, their eyes constantly scanning, their hands never far from concealed weapons. The casual invisibility I'd grown used to was replaced by hypervigilance that made my skin crawl. Albert summoned me to his study before I could reach Mike's rooms. His face was carved from stone, but I'd learned to read the subtle signs, the tightness around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. Something had happened. Something bad. "The Castellano family is making moves." His voice was clipped, controlled, the tone of a man managing a crisis through sheer force of will. "We've intercepted communications, suggesting they're planning something against me. The most effective way to hurt me would be through Michael. Kidnapping. Harm. Using him as leverage." My blood ran cold. How serious is the threat? Serious enough that I've tripled security. Serious enough that I'm telling you this. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to step back. "Your role doesn't change. Mike needs his routine, his normalcy. If he senses fear, if his anxiety spikes, it could trigger an attack. But you cannot, under any circumstances, let him out of your sight. Not for a second. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat tight. "I understand. There will be security with you at all times during outdoor sessions. They'll maintain distance, but they'll be armed and alert. If anything feels wrong, if you see anything unusual, anyone unfamiliar, you get Mike inside immediately. Use the panic button I'm having installed in your phone. My men will reach you within seconds." He pulled something from his desk drawer, a small device that looked like a medical alert pendant. "Mike will wear this. It's a tracker. If he's moved from approved locations, alarms trigger across the entire security network." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower. "He cannot know about the threat. He's already afraid of so much. If he learns that people might want to hurt him specifically, it could break him. I'll keep everything as normal as possible," I promised, though my hands were shaking. "He won't know." Albert stood, moved around the desk, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked almost vulnerable. "I need you to understand something, Miss Spencer. If anything happens to him, if I lose him because I allowed this, allowed him to have activities outside, allowed him to have you, nothing will save you. Not your intentions, not your compassion. Nothing." The words should have sounded like a threat, should have terrified me, but his tone wasn't menacing. It was desperate, raw. The voice of a father admitting his greatest fear out loud. "I know," I said quietly. "But Mr. Rohde, hiding him away completely, locking him in his room. That's letting them win even if they never lay a hand on him. That's letting fear destroy him from the inside. We have to find a balance between safety and living. His jaw clenched. Then find it. Because I can't. I've spent 7 years building walls to keep him safe. And now I have to trust someone else to keep him alive while tearing those walls down. Do you have any idea how much that terrifies me? Yes, I said honestly. Because if something happens to Mike, I lose more than my life. I lose my second chance at saving a child. I lose the purpose that's kept me going since David died. So I'm just as invested in keeping him safe as you are. Albert studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. The security team has been briefed. They know you have final authority over Mike's activities. If you say stop, everyone stops. If you say inside, everyone moves inside. They'll follow your lead. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like physical pressure. How long until the threat passes? Could be days. Could be weeks. The Castellanos are careful, patient. They won't move until they see an opening. Our job is to make sure they never find one. I returned to Mike shortly after, my mind racing, my smile forced into place. He was waiting in the sunroom, but the moment I entered, I saw the anxiety in his eyes. The security presence hadn't escaped his notice. "Why are there so many guards today?" he asked, his small hands already fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, a nervous habit I'd learned to recognize. "Your father has some important business meetings this week," I said carefully. "Just extra precautions. Nothing for you to worry about. How about we work on that breathing exercise you liked yesterday? The one that makes you feel like you're blowing up a balloon." Mike nodded, but the tension didn't leave his small body. And as we went through our session, I felt the weight of Albert's words, the presence of armed men just outside the windows, the knowledge that somewhere out there, people who meant harm were watching, waiting. I'd promised to keep Mike safe. I'd promised to keep him living. But for the first time, I wondered if those two promises might be impossible to keep simultaneously. The garden had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White tents billowed in the afternoon breeze, their silk panels catching sunlight and casting soft shadows across tables laden with food. String lights hung between ancient oak trees, waiting for evening. Children in expensive clothes chased each other across manicured lawns while adults clustered in careful social groups, their conversations a mixture of business and pleasure that I'd learned was typical of Albert's world. Mike stood beside me near the terrace, his small hand gripping mine tightly, his eyes wide as he watched the other children play. He wore a navy suit that matched his father's, but Albert had allowed me to skip the bow tie, a small concession that felt like a major victory. This was Mike's first real social event, the first time he'd been permitted to interact with other children outside of carefully controlled medical environments. "You don't have to play if you don't want to," I told him gently. "We can just watch. No pressure." "But I want to," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tremor that was equal parts fear and excitement. "I just don't know if I remember how." My heart broke and soared simultaneously. "You remember. Your body remembers. Just start slow. If you feel tight in your chest, you come right back to me. Deal. Deal." He took a deep breath, the kind I'd taught him, centering and calming. Then he let go of my hand and walked toward a group of children playing with a soccer ball on the lawn. I watched with my heart in my throat as a boy about Mike's age smiled and passed him the ball. Mike kicked it back, gentle and cautious, but genuinely engaged. Within minutes, he was part of their game. His movements careful but real, his face lit with concentration and something I'd rarely seen, pure joy. "Is that Michael Rohde?" a woman in a cream dress asked beside me, her tone incredulous. "I've never seen him play before. I didn't think he was allowed." "He's been working very hard," I said carefully, aware that multiple parents were now watching Mike with expressions ranging from surprise to curiosity. "He's stronger than people give him credit for." Another mother approached, her designer sunglasses pushed up into perfectly styled hair. "You must be the miracle worker Albert hired. I heard he brought someone in to help with Michael's health. The change is remarkable, truly." I smiled politely, but kept my focus on Mike. He was laughing now, running slowly after the ball, his breathing controlled and steady. Every few minutes, he'd glance back at me, seeking reassurance, and I'd nod encouragingly. This was everything I'd hoped for. This was childhood. This was living. For 3 hours, the party continued in peaceful perfection. Mike played, rested, drank water I'd prepared with his medications mixed in, then played again. Albert circulated among his guests, conducting business with the efficiency of a man who could negotiate deals while appearing social. but his eyes constantly tracked his son. I caught him watching several times, and the expression on his face was complex. Pride mixed with terror, hope mixed with barely controlled anxiety. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, I allowed myself to relax slightly. Maybe this would work. Maybe we could find that balance between safety and freedom. Maybe Mike could have a normal childhood after all. That's when I noticed the security team's behavior shift. Subtle changes most guests wouldn't register, but I'd been around them long enough to recognize the signs. Hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Eyes scanning the perimeter more frequently. Quiet communications through hidden earpieces. Something was happening. Albert noticed too. I saw him excuse himself from a conversation and move toward Marcus, his head of security, their discussion brief and intense. When Albert's eyes found mine across the garden, I read the message clearly. Stay alert. Stay close to Mike. Be ready. But he didn't call off the party. Didn't pull Mike inside. Because his son was playing with other children, laughing, being normal for perhaps the first time in his life. And Albert Rhodey, the man who controlled territories and commanded fear with a glance, couldn't bring himself to take that away. So the party continued. The children played. The parents socialized. And somewhere beyond the estate's walls, something dangerous was moving closer. I just didn't know how close until it was too late. The first gunshot shattered the afternoon like breaking glass. For a split second, no one moved, confused by the sound, brains refusing to process what couldn't possibly be happening at a children's garden party. Then the second shot came, and the third, and suddenly the world exploded into chaos. Screams erupted. Adults grabbed children, running in all directions. Security men drew weapons, shouting commands that were lost in the panic. The white tents that had looked so elegant moments before became obstacles, billowing silk blocking escape routes. I saw men in dark clothing pouring through a breach in the eastern wall, their weapons raised, their intent clear. Mike. Where was Mike? I spotted him near the oak trees, frozen in terror, his small body rigid with fear. I ran toward him as bullets tore through the air above us, the sound impossibly loud, impossibly close. Other children were being dragged away by their parents, security forming human shields around Albert's guests. But Mike stood alone, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. I reached him just as his breathing changed. That horrible wheezing sound I'd learned to dread, the sound of his airway constricting, his lungs fighting for oxygen they couldn't get. His hands clawed at his throat, panic making everything worse. Mike, look at me. I dropped to my knees, grabbing his face between my hands, forcing his eyes to focus on mine. Look at me. We've practiced this. You know what to do. Can't breathe, he gasped, his lips already taking on a bluish tint. Miss Spencer, we need to move. A security guard shouted, materializing beside us. Now, get to the house. His inhaler is in the house, I shouted back. He can't make it. His airway is closing. Then we carry him. No, moving him like this, with his breathing this compromised, could make it worse. We do this here. Now. I turned back to Mike, blocking out the gunfire, the screams, the chaos. Belly breathing, Mike. Remember. Slow in through your nose. Feel your belly rise. You can do this. You've done it 100 times. Scared, he wheezed, tears streaming down his face. Gonna die. No, I'm right here. I'm not leaving you. In through your nose, Mike. Count with me. 1, 2, 3. His small hand found mine, gripping so tightly his knuckles went white. Better. That's better. Now hold it. 1, 2, 3. Now out through your mouth, slow, like you're blowing through a straw. The guard was screaming into his radio. We need medical at the eastern lawn. The boy is down. Repeat. The boy is down. Around us, the firefight continued. I heard Albert's voice somewhere in the chaos, commanding his men, directing the defense. But I couldn't focus on that. Couldn't focus on anything except Mike's face, his breathing, keeping him conscious and calm when everything in his body was screaming panic. I shifted my position, covering him with my body, making myself a shield between him and the violence. In through your nose, Mike. You're doing so good, so brave. Just keep breathing with me. Something whistled past my ear, close enough that I felt the displacement of air. Gunfire. Too close. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. Mike's breathing was starting to slow, to deepen slightly. If I moved now, if I let fear take over, he'd panic again, and this time his airway might close completely. Then suddenly Albert was there. He appeared like a force of nature, his suit torn, his face splattered with blood that I prayed wasn't his own, his eyes wild with terror. He started to reach for Mike, but I grabbed his hand. Don't move him yet. His breathing is stabilizing, but if we move him wrong, if he panics again, we could lose him. I held Albert's gaze. Trust me, please. For a moment, Albert Rohde, the man who trusted no one, looked at me with naked vulnerability. Then he nodded. What do you need? His inhaler. Blue case. In the sunroom on the table by the windows. Marcus. Albert barked to his head of security. The inhaler. Now. He turned back to Mike, dropping to his knees beside us, and his voice when he spoke was gentler than I'd ever heard. I'm here, son. You're safe. Miss Spencer is taking care of you. Mike's eyes found his father's face, and something in his breathing eased further. Daddy. Scared. I know, but you're being so brave. Keep breathing with Miss Spencer, just like she taught you. Marcus returned within seconds, the inhaler in his blood-stained hand. I administered it carefully, 2 puffs, waiting between them, monitoring Mike's response. The medication began working almost immediately, his airway relaxing, color returning to his lips. The gunfire had stopped. Albert's men had neutralized the threat, but the damage was done. The beautiful garden party had become a war zone, and in the center of it all, Albert Rohde knelt beside me in the grass, his hand on his son's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath that meant life. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his eyes. Saw the moment I stopped being an employee, stopped being a risk he was managing. In that moment, watching me shield his son with my body, watching me refuse to run when everyone else had fled, something fundamental changed. You saved him, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. You could have run. My men were shouting at you to run, but you stayed. I made a promise, I said simply. I don't break promises. Not anymore. Albert reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on Mike's shoulder, and the weight of that touch carried more meaning than words ever could. 3 days after the attack, I found myself standing in a bedroom that was larger than my entire former apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the eastern gardens, where workers were already repairing the damage from the assault. The furniture was elegant but comfortable, the closet filled with clothes that actually fit me, expensive brands I'd never dreamed of owning, a private bathroom with heated floors, a small sitting area with a fireplace. This wasn't staff quarters. This was a guest suite in the main house. Albert had moved me here the morning after the attack, his instructions clear and non-negotiable. You're not sleeping in the staff wing anymore. You're not staff. Marcus had assigned me 2 personal security guards who rotated shifts, men whose sole job was ensuring my safety. My salary had tripled overnight, the new contract delivered to my room by Albert's personal attorney, along with a private health insurance policy and a pension plan that made my hands shake when I read the numbers. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was something else entirely. I just wasn't sure what. Mike had recovered with surprising resilience. The asthma attack had been severe, but my intervention had prevented it from becoming critical. More surprisingly, surviving the crisis seemed to have strengthened him rather than traumatized him. He talked about it with a kind of quiet pride, how he'd used his breathing techniques even when he was terrified, how he'd trusted me when everything was chaos. It was as if facing his fear and surviving had proven to him that he was stronger than anyone, including himself, had believed. On the 3rd evening, Albert summoned me to the library. He stood by the windows, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his posture less rigid than usual. The past 72 hours had aged him, new lines visible around his eyes, but there was something different in his bearing, something softer. The Castellano family has been dealt with, he said without preamble. The men who organized the attack are dead. The family leadership has been made to understand that any further moves against me or mine will result in their complete destruction. The threat is over. I'm glad, I said quietly, taking the seat he gestured toward. How is Mike really doing? Better than I am, Albert admitted, a wry smile touching his lips. He asked me this morning when we could have another garden party. Said next time he wants to try playing soccer properly, not just passing the ball back and forth. He sat across from me, and the exhaustion in his face was evident. I've been thinking about what happened, about how my overprotectiveness almost killed him. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't known what to do, if you'd panicked or run like any rational person would have, I'd have lost him, not to the Castellanos, to my own fear. You were trying to keep him safe, I said. That's what parents do. No. I was trying to keep him from dying because I was too terrified of loss to let him live. There's a difference. You showed me that difference. His dark eyes held mine. You also showed me something else. That trust isn't weakness. That letting someone else care for what matters most isn't surrendering control. It's choosing strength. He set down his glass, leaned forward slightly. I haven't let anyone close since Elena died. Not really. I've had relationships, arrangements, but nothing real. Nothing that required me to actually trust another person with anything that mattered. And then you walked into my study and told me my son was dying slowly. And something in me recognized the truth even though it terrified me. Albert, I started, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. When I saw you covering Mike with your body during the attack, when I saw you refusing to leave him, even when bullets were flying, I realized something. You don't work for me, Miss Spencer. You haven't for a while. You're part of this family now. Part of his life. Part of my life. And I'm asking if that's something you want to continue. The question hung in the air, weighted with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to examine. What exactly are you asking me, Mr. Rohde? I'm asking if you'll stay. Not just as Mike's therapist. As part of our lives. Whatever that becomes. His voice dropped lower. I'm asking if you're willing to trust me the way I've learned to trust you. Because I think we could help each other heal. I think we already have been. I looked at this powerful, dangerous man who had somehow become human to me, who had shown me vulnerability few people ever witnessed, who had given me purpose when I thought I'd never find it again. And I thought about Mike, laughing in the garden, learning to be a child, about the family we'd accidentally created in the midst of chaos and fear. Yes, I said simply. I want to stay. For Mike. And for you. For all of us. Albert's shoulders relaxed. Tension I hadn't realized he was carrying draining away. Good. He stood, extended his hand to help me up, and when I took it, he didn't let go immediately. Thank you, Jenny. For giving me my son back. For giving me hope that we might actually have a future worth living. Thank you for trusting me, I replied. For letting me be part of something that matters. We stood there in the library, two broken people who'd found a way to heal each other, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life had changed irrevocably. I was no longer Jenny Spencer, struggling single mother and invisible maid. I was family. I was home. 3 months later, I stood in the estate's grand foyer, watching Mike adjust his school backpack, his small face serious as he double-checked that his inhaler was in the front pocket where it belonged. He wore the uniform of Westridge Academy, a prestigious private school that had initially balked at accepting a child with severe asthma until Albert made it clear that rejecting his son would be a decision they'd regret. The school now had a full medical support plan in place, a nurse trained in respiratory emergencies, and strict protocols that somehow didn't make Mike feel singled out or different. You have everything? I asked. The question part of our morning routine now. Inhaler, water bottle, emergency contact card. Everything, Mike confirmed, then grinned at me with a confidence that still took my breath away. And Miss Patterson said I can try out for the soccer team next month if my breathing stays good. The beginners team? The one that just practices once a week? That's wonderful, I said, crouching down to his level. Remember what we talked about. If you feel tight in your chest, I stop, do my breathing exercises, and tell an adult, I know, Jenny. Mike rolled his eyes with the exasperated affection of a child who'd heard the same instructions 1,000 times. You worry too much. Someone has to, I teased, ruffling his hair. The car is ready, Albert said, appearing in the doorway of his study. His presence still commanded attention, but the hard edges had softened over the past months. He smiled at his son, genuine warmth replacing the careful control that used to define every interaction. Have a good day at school, Michael. I want to hear all about your math test when you get home. It's just multiplication tables, Dad. Mike shrugged with 8-year-old nonchalance, but I saw the pleasure in his eyes at his father's interest. Not hard. After Mike left with his security detail, discreetly positioned to look like regular drivers rather than armed guards, Albert and I walked together toward the eastern gardens. The damage from the attack had been completely repaired, the space transformed back into the peaceful sanctuary it had been. But now children's toys were scattered across the lawn. A soccer goal stood at one end, and the garden had become a place for living rather than just looking. We'd fallen into an easy companionship over the past months, Albert and I. Not quite friendship, not quite something more, but a connection built on shared purpose and mutual respect. He'd learned to trust my judgment with Mike, to let go of the suffocating control that had almost destroyed them both. I'd learned that the feared Mafia boss was also a father who read bedtime stories in different voices and could be reduced to helpless laughter by his son's terrible jokes. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Mike played soccer in the garden with 2 other children from his school, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. A medical supervisor sat nearby, unobtrusive but attentive, ready if needed but not hovering. Mike ran, carefully but genuinely, his breathing controlled, his face flushed with exertion and joy. Albert and I watched from the terrace, cups of coffee growing cold on the table between us. "Look at him," Albert said softly. 3 months ago, I couldn't imagine this, couldn't let myself imagine it. "He's thriving," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "He's becoming exactly who he was always meant to be, because you refused to let him be anything less." Albert turned to face me fully. "I've been thinking about what you said that night in my study, about the difference between existing and living. I spent 7 years keeping Mike alive, but teaching him to be afraid of life itself. You showed both of us that we could choose differently. You let me," I reminded him. "You could have fired me that first day, could have thrown me out for daring to challenge you. Instead, you took the most terrifying risk of your life. You trusted." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Mike score a goal and celebrate with his friends. Then Albert's hand moved toward mine, tentative, questioning. I looked down at our hands, almost touching on the terrace railing, understanding the significance of the gesture. This wasn't employer to employee. This was something far more complicated and precious. I took his hand, threading my fingers through his, and felt him release a breath he'd been holding. "You gave him his life back," Albert said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Gave us both our lives back." "You let me," I replied. "That was the bravest thing you could have done. Letting go is always harder than holding on." His grip tightened slightly. "I'm still learning. Still terrified every time he runs, every time he laughs too hard. But I'm learning to trust that the risk is worth it. That love means letting someone live, not just keeping them breathing." Below us, Mike laughed as he chased the ball, his small body strong and confident, alive in every sense of the word. And standing there with Albert's hand in mine, I realized something profound. I'd thought I was helping Mike honor David's memory by giving him the childhood my son never got to have. But in the process, I'd found something I'd thought was lost forever. Purpose, family, home. What started as one forbidden act of compassion, one moment of defiant empathy in a ballroom full of indifference, had created something neither Albert nor I could have imagined. A family bound not by blood or obligation, but by trust, by healing, by the courage to let go of fear and choose life instead. Unconventional, complicated, built on the foundation of shared loss and hard-won hope, but real, achingly, beautifully real. And as the sun set over the garden where Mike played, where laughter replaced fear and joy replaced isolation, I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be, not replacing what I'd lost, but honoring it by helping others find what I'd learned the hard way. That living, truly living, requires the courage to risk everything, including your heart. What a journey this has been. From a terrified little boy watching other children play, to a confident child running and laughing in his own garden. From a grieving mother stuck in her pain, to a woman who found purpose again. From a father imprisoned by fear, to a man learning to trust. This is what great stories do. They remind us that transformation is possible, that healing is real, that love in all its forms has the power to save us. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you. If you want more stories that touch your heart and remind you of what matters most, please subscribe. Your support means everything and helps me continue creating content that hopefully makes your day a little better, your heart a little fuller. Until the next story, take care of yourself and remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply be kind. Thank you.